Every time we vote, we're standing up side by side with the Founding Fathers, with the men of Valley Forge, with patriots and pioneers throughout our history, with all those who dedicated their lives to making this a nation of the people, by the people, and for the people.
Elections are the lifeblood of our democracy. They are the mechanism by which the American people choose who is going to rule on their behalf and for their interests and welfare. Without elections, there would be no way for the American people, for us, to exercise our legitimate sway on the future direction of this country.
In half the country, and we're getting some interesting results coming in from those battleground states.
If you're a Republican, you say, wow. If you're a Democrat, you say, uh-oh.
You see, Donald Trump is now starting to widen his lead. President Trump now with 54% of the vote.
The president right now has the lead in the Keystone State.
We have a great night, and we're going to have, much more importantly, we're going to have a great 4 years.
The 2020 election haunts the American mind.
Here's where it gets really bizarre. Fulton County, most populous county, it is Atlanta. They just stopped counting. Nevada, meanwhile, has stopped counting votes.
They've all stopped counting for the night?
All right, welcome back. This is CNN special live coverage, 10:31 a.m. on the East Coast. Why am I giving you the time? Well, if you managed to sleep last night, things changed. You may have gone to bed thinking this election was headed one way, and then you woke up and you saw things were different.
Also overnight, Joe Biden pulled ahead in the state of Georgia.
Joe Biden takes the lead in Pennsylvania.
Okay, we have an announcement to make.
Joe Biden has run for president 3 times, and the third time has turned out to be the charm.
One side insists it was the most secure election in U.S. history.
Let me begin with one immutable fact. The 2020 election was the most secure election in American history.
It was the cleanest election, the safest election, the most secure election ever run.
Make no mistake, there has been no evidence of any significant widespread voter fraud.
Let me say it again. The 2020 election was the most secure election in American history.
Period.
This same side accuses anyone who disagrees with them of perpetrating a big lie
or the big delusion.
The big lie keeps getting repeated.
The big lie is just that, a big lie.
And despite a relentless media barrage, the other side remains convinced there was widespread election fraud.
What I saw was not a secure and transparent election.
Poll watchers claim the Travis County Clerk's Office is locking them out.
Last night there was a major software glitch that actually delayed the counting of all of the ballots.
A look at election fraud, and I want to look at secretaries of state who illegally changed the voter laws without the permission of their state legislature.
There have been numerous attempts to prove election fraud.
It's a van dropping off ballots in the early morning hours of November 4th, 8 hours past the deadline.
She said her mother was in a nursing home and did not have the mental capacity to vote.
We've obtained video time that shows a man dropping several ballots into a drop box.
Scottsdale woman pleads guilty to casting a ballot in her dead mother's name.
Shows a man buying a registration form for an absentee ballot from a voter, giving him, quote, pocket money, unquote, of $200.
Yet courts have refused to consider these cases on the merits.
The Supreme Court rejecting an effort by Republicans to reverse President-elect Joe Biden's win in Pennsylvania.
The Supreme Court has rejected the Texas-led effort to toss out election results in 4 key states.
Even some Republicans dismiss the idea of systematic fraud and call for us to move on.
Fraud did not play a role in the outcome of the election.
The election was fair as we've seen. We simply did not win the election as Republicans for the presidency.
Rather than reject what happened on the 6th, reject the lies about the election, and make clear that a president who engaged in those activities can never be president again.
But we can't move on unless we know the truth. Many other issues arise out of the 2020 election. Did the January 6th protesters go to D.C. to mount an insurrection? It wasn't an insurrection, it was a primal scream.
To protect the Constitution of the United
They wanted their elected leaders to adjudicate the claims of election fraud. The left's claim that this was the most secure election is also the foundation for the widespread censorship on social media of the so-called big lie.
This morning, President Trump waking up without his favorite megaphone.
You will never again see a tweet from President Trump.
But is it a big lie? Is it a lie at all?
I've been working with Greg Phillips. I don't know if I've ever introduced him to you, but he has a deep background in election intelligence. He's worked projects all over the world. He's a massive 30-year experience. We decided to test a hypothesis, and we went really big. And now we have something that we think you're going to really want to see. So I'll send you the address separately.
Now, Greg Phillips, what's your background that prepares you for this kind of work?
I've been in and around election intelligence and integrity for about 40 years. We've done investigations literally all over the world. It's a combination of data acquisition, data analysis, occasionally some in-depth data mining. Our ability to draw meaningful conclusions that link the who to the when to the where is significant in the space.
Catherine, you started the group called True the Vote in the year 2010. What was your mission or objective?
We just didn't have enough volunteers working at the polls in our local elections. So we began by training people to work in the polls, and then as we got further into it, we recognized, wow, some of the problems you see at the polls can be attributed to problems in the voter rolls. Well, what can we do about the voter rolls? And so it turned into something much bigger than we had anticipated.
True the Vote has the largest store of election intelligence for the 2020 elections in the world. No one has more data than we do.
So I started True the Vote to ensure that every American voter has an opportunity to participate in elections.
I think I became familiar with your work when you gave congressional testimony. Now that was in the year 2014. In fact, I met you through Debbie, and I think what's interesting is that you not only have known Debbie for years, but you trained her.
Absolutely. I was a bilingual poll watcher.
Oh yes.
So my Spanish language came in very handy. I was a poll watcher in Rosenberg, and the poll judge was telling this couple that came in Spanish who to vote for. And of course, she didn't really realize that I knew Spanish, and so there we go.
And you busted them.
I busted them.
Yeah. So Catherine, when you set up True the Vote, you set it up not so much, it's not a partisan organization. Is that because you saw shenanigans, problems with voting as coming out of both parties?
Oh, absolutely. Plus, we need parity of parties at the polls.
Well, you told me about this remarkable election in which you had vote harvesting and vote trafficking, but it was on behalf of a Republican candidate.
Exactly. In North Carolina, it was unique in that it actually overturned an election.
There's going to be a new election in the North Carolina congressional district engulfed in a scandal over voting fraud.
This all centers around allegations that an operative for Harris then hired a team of people to harvest absentee ballots, paying them between $2 and $3 a vote.
So you have an activist, the guy's name was McCrae Dowless, and he worked for the Bladen Improvement Association, which was a kind of an African-American get voters to the polls, but apparently they were doing all kinds of vote harvesting, and he learned the strategy that he broke with them. And he took his services to Mark Harris, a Republican, well actually a pastor who was running.
Correct.
And Harris won, he pulled it off.
In 40 years of doing this, we've seen this over and over again. Sometimes the schemes are a little bit different. Sometimes it's people out banging on doors, gathering ballots. Sometimes the ballots are sent here, gathered here, deposited there. But the trafficking itself is always the same basic pattern. There's a nonprofit involved somewhere in the middle. There are people that are either collecting those ballots on the one hand or depositing those ballots on the other and getting paid for it.
In no case is acceptable to be paid for your ballot or to accept some form of remuneration for your ballot. And in no way, in no time, is that
I noticed, Catherine, that in the immediate aftermath of the election, when there were a lot of accusations and charges flying around, all reflecting these suspicions of something went deeply wrong, charges of foreign intervention, charges of machines, you and your organization were kind of dead silent. I got the impression that you were looking for a different approach.
Given the outliers that were introduced in such a major way in 2020, namely the privately funded drop boxes, the mass mail out of ballots, the hypothesis was if you were going to cheat, how might one go about this? That would be provable, trackable, traceable.
You said there might be some, let's just call them bad actors, who are delivering ballots systematically and illicitly to these mail-in drop boxes, and there might be a way to track them and to bust them.
We didn't know. We decided we're going to let the data tell the tale, and we collected together a team of highly skilled contractors and put together a plan to see where the data would take us.
What, Greg, is geo-tracking?
So the idea is to collect these signals that are emitted from your phone. Your cell phone is delivering information to apps that are collecting that ping. So there are 4 key coordinates: the lat long, the elevation, and the time. And with that data, we can then build a pattern of life around you. So that phone's here right now. Well, where's it going to be at 5 o'clock? And where's it going to be tonight?
Well, here's my cell phone. My cell phone is off. Can I be geo-tracked even with the cell phone being off?
Possibly.
Depending on the apps that are on the phone.
That's what marketing companies do all day, every day.
Now, this is the point. We were at the Apple store and at CVS, and on both occasions, they knew where you were evidently.
Absolutely.
And they were telling you about specials, and they were, so people have experience of this.
There's 300,000 or so apps that gather that data, and then they sell it to brokers.
Isn't it also true that this geo-tracking has now become a vital tool for the military, for the intelligence agencies, and for law enforcement?
Indeed, they're using it almost every day. I'll say that there's no question amongst anyone that I know in the community that many, if not all, of the people that were involved in the situation at the Capitol on January 6th were being tracked previous to January 6th, because they already knew what their pattern of life was. They already knew who to look at.
Many of the people who stormed the U.S. Capitol on January 6th left digital footprints that law enforcement has used in making arrests.
You're saying they must have known about these people before, because some of those guys were arrested 1 day, 3 days, 5 days after January 6th, and that's not enough time to do the geo-tracking analysis.
The very idea that you could go from the afternoon of January 6th to acquiring the data, tracking the data, unmask who actually owns that phone, which the government is required to do, and then get it to a grand jury, make an arrest in 72 hours?
Impossible.
It's not possible. They had to have been tracking the people in advance. But the fact of the matter is, these techniques are used every single day by law enforcement, the intelligence community, the Department of Defense.
Was geo-tracking part of the way that the CIA was able to identify bin Laden?
It certainly played a role. It's even more sophisticated today than it was when bin Laden was disposed of. More and more apps are participating in this program, if you will.
The reliability of geo-tracking is not substantially different from the reliability of a fingerprint or the reliability of DNA if it identifies your phone. Now, I could have given my phone to Debbie, but the simple truth of it is my phone was there on this particular date, and there's absolutely no question about that, right?
That's correct.
Now, you decided to purchase through these brokers that make this information available to companies, they make it available all kinds of places to buy data. Let's talk about the methodology. You identified data in certain places, and by and large you focused on the states where the election was decided. Tell us, what are the areas that you bought data for, and what were you looking for? And what's the time period?
October 1st through the election. In Georgia, we actually bought from October 1st through January 6th after the runoff. So we went in, We decided to do the Atlanta metro area because it picks up some rural areas, it picks up some urban areas, it picks up some suburban areas. 309 drop boxes in the area. And we thought, okay, well, this is a pretty good test. We, in essence, sort of fenced around those.
Geofencing.
And then we were able to make purchase of data of people that had been near those drop boxes, but also near the organizations. Across the country, we bought 10 trillion signals.
When they give you this data that you then have to go through, what does this data look like?
Well, it's a massive data transfer. We have more than a petabyte of data. You're talking about transacting hundreds of terabytes, so it's a significant move of data.
You have 10 trillion signals, that's a lot of signals. So what was the criterion that you set?
Final decision was they had to have been to 10 or more drop boxes, meaning unique visits inside of a space, and 5 or more visits to one or more of these organizations.
Those were the outliers. It was such an aberrant pattern.
So what you're saying, and it seems to me there's no reason for someone to go to even 2 drop boxes, but you're saying that maybe there's a conceivable reason someone did that. Let's identify a large number of drop boxes and multiple trips, and that way we're going to catch not all the offenders, right, but the worst offenders.
The way we would describe it is we want to absolutely ensure that we don't have false positives, meaning including people that should not have been included. We're not in any way saying that this is all there is. We're just saying that based on our criteria that we identified in Atlanta, 242 people that went to an average of 24 drop boxes in 8 organizations during a 2-week period.
242 mules. Now let's pause for a second. What is a mule?
When we started the project, we had to figure out how are we going to describe the individuals and the elements involved. And to us, it felt a lot like a cartel. It felt a lot like trafficking. And it can be trafficking in drugs, trafficking in humans. In this instance, it's ballot trafficking, and so we began to use that vernacular. A mule is, by our definition, a person that is involved in picking up ballots from locations and running them to the drop boxes. So you have the collectors on the one hand, you have the stash houses, which are the nonprofits, and then you have the mules that are doing the drops.
What do we know about them? Who are they?
Well, first let me say, this is not grandma out walking her dog. Bad backgrounds, bad reputations. We've had encounters with several that are not terribly positive.
Violent guys.
Can be. They are interested in one thing, that's money.
Do we know, by the way, how much they get paid?
According to the people that have shared information with us, it's generally $10 a ballot. In the Georgia runoff, that number was higher.
2020, of course, was the year of the Antifa riots, the BLM riots, and it was all going on in the months and weeks leading up to the election.
Right.
And so in the data, you have geo-tracking data of the drop boxes, but you also have data on the rioters.
There were several different violent BLM Antifa riots in Atlanta. In one of them, we had 36 of our mules participate in these violent riots. There's an organization that tracks the device IDs across all violent protests around the world. We took a look at our 242 mules in Atlanta, and sure enough, dozens and dozens and dozens of our mules show up on the ACLID databases. So again, this is not grandma out walking her dog. These are, violent criminals sometimes.
There's not just a criminal element, but there is an ideological element, and that there's an overlap between people. I mean, you're not going to go to an Antifa riot and find it overpopulated with patriots or Christians or Republicans. These are people generally the far left. And turns out that these are people who also help to make up the mule population.
I think that's also borne out in our target organizations themselves. They're not like Republican organizations.
These are left-wing Democratic organizations. Yeah. Let's zoom in here. So the mule is the delivery man,
the mule is the delivery
woman. And what you're saying is they have a starting point or multiple starting points, and then they have the end point. And the end point is the drop box.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
But you're saying that they get the ballots from somewhere, and then they go deposit them in multiple drop boxes.
One of the questions that will come up in the work that we've done is, well, how do you know that this wasn't just somebody that's got a big family and they just deposited a bunch of ballots once? Or how do you know that this person didn't just work at a location that is near a drop box and so they're constantly going by a drop box? And the elements that are additive here, the going to the nonprofits, the ability to identify the pattern of approach to a drop box, and that it is going not past a drop box and on, but directly to a drop box and back to another point and then to another Dropbox. All of these things.
I mean, isn't the timing significant? If some guy's going to a Dropbox at 2 a.m. in the morning, presumably he's not like out for a walk.
Right.
So we're going to show you a visual, a pattern of life that someone can see and look at rather than just a whole spreadsheet of numbers, being able to look at it in this manner. What you see here on the screen is a single person on a single day in Atlanta, Georgia. They went to 28 drop boxes in 5 organizations in one day.
What are the orange dots?
Those are drop boxes.
And what is the blue tracks?
That is a smoothed out pattern of life so that we could take the sort of the movement of the individual cell phone signals, marry them together into something that's visual so that you can see movement on the individual. To get to some of these drop boxes, you had to be intentional. You had to get off the highway, you had to go on surface streets, you had to turn in somewhere in order to get to those drop boxes.
And the circles, I take it, reflect the nonprofit centers, are not the places where the ballots originate?
The stash houses, where the ballots are collected and handed to the mules to take to the drop box.
Now let's move over to Arizona. How many mules in Arizona?
A little over 200.
A little over 200.
In Phoenix alone.
The reason I think this is all very significant is because these were very close states, right? What was the margin in Georgia?
10 or 11,000, I think, in the end.
In the end.
And Arizona also extremely close.
Yeah, very close.
Then you moved on to
Wisconsin, but our initial look was in Milwaukee. Gross numbers were a little down, but the average number of visits to the drop boxes was up. So instead of having only 24 unique visits, I think we averaged 28.
I mean, maybe I've heard people in Milwaukee are really hardworking, and maybe they just went overtime. And then let's go to Michigan.
We have more than 500 mules that we've identified in Michigan. Again, the number of boxes is lower.
Now, where in Michigan?
Detroit mainly. But we have people in Detroit that went to more than 100 drop boxes.
I mean, this is stunning because it's like, I cannot think of a rational, kind of innocent reason for someone to do that. It just doesn't exist.
No.
So any reasonable person would say, you're onto something big here.
We should take a closer look.
Let's go to Pennsylvania, critical state. I think it was Pennsylvania that really gave Biden the election.
Philadelphia alone, we've identified more than 1,100 mules at rates well beyond anything we'd seen. Closer to 50 drop boxes each.
Each guy going to 50 drop boxes?
Each. 1,100. We saw people driving back and forth to New Jersey across the bridge.
But you're saying the ballots may not even be from Philadelphia or from Pennsylvania.
We're saying somebody should
But you're saying that the origin
Yeah.
point appears to be Jersey. Now, running 1,100 mules times 50, we are 50,000 drop box visits by the mules alone in Philadelphia or greater Philadelphia area. Now, as you were assessing this data, you had, the two of you, and I'm not sure which of you came up with this, a genius idea in my view. Or was your... Of course! Of course, who else? Well, to validate your data,
we chose to look at 2 murders that were ebbing on cold case status.
And in Atlanta, 8-year-old Secoria Turner was killed by rounds of gunfire shot into a car. It happened just outside this Wendy's parking lot.
Bought the data and the team got to work.
You could see visually that there were only a handful of unique devices that could possibly have pulled the trigger. So this is the area, and this is where the Wendy's was.
And are you saying that each green dot is the same guy, but moving through time?
Each color is one person. The shooting actually occurred right here in this parking lot, sort of inside of this circle are really the only potentially legitimate shooters. Each of these devices has a unique device ID, and we turned the bulk of this information over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Now, I read, they've arrested 2 suspects.
They have.
2 suspected gang members will appear in court this morning on charges that include the shooting death of 8-year-old Secoria Turner.
And isn't it true that this tracking these movements, this parallels exactly the work you're doing with the mules?
Exactly.
It's one thing to have the scientific evidence, which is persuasive on its own merits, but do you have video evidence?
We do.
How much of it do you have?
4 million minutes of surveillance video around the country.
Official surveillance video of these mail-in drop boxes?
Yes.
How do you get it?
You can file for open records requests. Any citizen can do this. It was a very difficult series of steps that had to be followed to procure the actual surveillance video.
Do you have video in Georgia?
We do.
Is it video from the presidential election, the runoff election, or both?
Both.
Do you have video from other states?
Some video from Arizona. We have recently learned video was specifically turned off on particular drop boxes.
In which state?
Arizona. Wisconsin, it turns out, even though the rules required them to have video.
Did they do the video?
No, they did not.
There should be video on every Dropbox.
Indeed.
Given today's kind of cost of technology, it would not have been that hard to do it. And you sent me a screenshot, Catherine, where you were requesting video, and I believe it was the state of Georgia saying this video does not exist and we can't tell you why it doesn't exist.
Right, that was in Fulton County. And we have correspondence like that from a lot of states. In the absence of video, that geospatial data is key to decoding, what the greater scheme was. But in the case of what we're going to show you now, what kicks it up a notch is that we have the geospatial data to support the video.
Let's talk about some of the videos.
So we're going to show you a couple different ones. This particular individual we have in a number of different locations at a number of different times. He's actually a mule.
This is the official surveillance video of Georgia.
Absolutely.
And so as the person pulls up, they don't even bother parking. Of course, it's the middle of the night, so why would they? He gets out, approaches the box. When people walk up with intention to cheat, they look around, they basically walk fairly quickly, they try to stuff him in, they try to get out of there. In this case, he drops a few on the ground, pick them up, stuff them into the box. Then he hustles back and hustles out of there. So this is what it looks like. It doesn't necessarily look like, hundreds of ballots being stuffed in.
You don't need a whole lot of fraud, you just need a little in the right places over time.
Is there a way to estimate, or even roughly, how many ballots are being tossed into a box at a given time?
It might be 3 or 5 or 6 or 10 or something like that.
The idea is to stay under the radar. And as Greg said, the number is, 3, 5, 10 ballots, but then they're not done for the day either. They're going place to place to place, day upon day upon day. And so that will not show up in your chain of custody documents, your tracking documents that would identify a big blip.
I mean, they're not going up and dumping in, buckets full of ballots. On the other hand, we've seen circumstances where it appears that buckets full of ballots showed up. There's one box in Gwinnett County that had a chain of custody document with 1,962 ballots noted on it. So first of all, that's roughly 10 times what we normally see. We sorted through the geodata, found a few hundred people. Okay, well, that's pretty odd. We have video of all of this. And guess what it shows? 271 people approached that ballot drop box during that 25-hour period. 271. 1,962 ballots were deposited.
Wow. Here are election officials pulling out of that drop box 2 full duffel bags containing over 1,900 ballots. Let's look at another one.
Yeah, let's take a look at...
Interesting thing about this person is the device seems to live in South Carolina. So this person isn't even from Georgia. She was here during both election cycles but is not a resident of the state.
But as she approaches the drop box, she never looks at the trash can, right?
She's looking the other way.
But the other thing she has is she has gloves on. What one of our analysts noticed was these surgical gloves only appeared from December 23rd forward in the runoff. So we didn't see a lot of them previous to December 23rd. And we couldn't figure out why. And then it just dawned on us, well, on December 22nd, there was an indictment handed down in Arizona for people that had stuffed ballots, and the way the FBI nailed them was fingerprints. And then lo and behold, the next day and days forward.
So this video is now from the Georgia runoffs. This is January of 21.
This particular one is at approximately 1 o'clock in the morning on January the 5th.
Stuffs her ballots in there. It's like a small stackish, maybe 3, maybe 4. Takes them off. And then puts them in a trash can that she never looked at.
So she knew it was there.
She knew it was there, right? And so we have her on a number of locations.
She's an out-of-state mule, and this is in no way the only drop box that she attended.
That's right.
No, she's goes to dozens and dozens over the course of these 2 elections.
Who's next?
What you're going to see is he approaches the drop box on his bike. He also has a backpack on. Pull the ballots out of his backpack.
Taking his time.
Taking his time, digging around, looking for some ballots. Finally gets out, pulls them out. Okay, now I'm set. And he'll put them in. But you also see him get sort of frustrated as he starts to leave, because guess what? At this point, they had started requiring the mules, apparently, to take pictures of the stuffing of the ballots. It appears that that's how they get paid. So they take a picture and stuff it in, they take a picture, not a selfie, but a picture of the actual ballot going in. But this guy gets frustrated, so he actually has to park his bike, get off.
So if you were there just casting your own ballot, what reason in the world would you have to come back and take a picture of the box?